Good morning Year 6 and welcome to this week's book talk session, and today we're starting our new book. We're going to be studying Stormbreaker with the character Alex Rider by Anthony Horowitz, and this will tie nicely into our next English unit when we finish Leon and the Place Between. So our first reason to read today, we're going to be reading the first chapter today, split into 3 sections, and our first lens from the Fantastics tier is the lens of feeling, and I want you to be thinking about that main character, Alex Rider, and his feelings as I read it to you. Chapter 1, Funeral Voices. When the doorbell rings at 3 in the morning, it's never good news. Alex Rider was woken by the first chime. His eyes flickered open, but for a moment he stayed completely still in his bed, lying on his back with his head resting on the pillow. He heard a bedroom door open and a creak of wood as somebody went downstairs. The bell rang a second time, and he looked at the alarm clock glowing beside him. 3:02 a.m. There was a rattle as someone slid the security chain off the front door. He rolled out of bed and walked over to the open window, his bare feet pressing down the carpet pile. The moonlight spilled onto his chest and shoulders. Alex was 14, already well built, with the body of an athlete. His hair, cut short, apart from 2 thick strands hanging over his forehead, was fair. His eyes were brown and serious. For a moment he stood silently, half hidden in the shadow, looking out. There was a police car parked outside. From his second-floor window, Alex could see the black ID number on the roof and the caps of the 2 men who were standing in front of the door. The porch light went on, and, at the same time, the door opened. "Mrs. Rider?" "No, I'm the housekeeper. What is it? What's happened?" "This is the home of Mr. Ian Rider." "Yes? I wonder if we could come in." And Alex already knew. He knew from the way the police stood there, awkward and unhappy. But he also knew from the tone of their voices, funeral voices. That was how he would describe them later. The sort of voices people use when they come to tell you that someone close to you has died. He went to his door and opened it. He could hear the 2 policemen talking down in the hall, but only some of the words reached him. "A car accident. Called the ambulance. Intensive care. Nothing anyone could do. So sorry." It was only hours later, sitting in the kitchen, watching as the grey light of morning bled slowly through the West London streets, that Alex could try to make sense of what had happened. His uncle, Ian Rider, was dead. Driving home, his car had been hit by a lorry at Old Street roundabout, and he had been killed almost instantly. He hadn't been wearing a seatbelt, the police said. Otherwise, he might have had a chance. And I'm going to leave it there, and that's our first reason to read section. So if we take this lens of feeling, and I want us to focus on, what does Anthony Horowitz want us to focus on first in this first chapter? So the author draws attention to which feeling from what I've just read to you. That's for one point. Can you answer it for another point? Can you go back in the video and find evidence from the text for your third point? And your bonus word to get 4 points for this section is apparent. What's made clear from what's been said about those feelings? So pause the video. This is your first reason to read sentence, please. Okay, our second reason for reading, we're going to be focusing on the stylistics layer, and we're going to be looking at impact and what impact does it have on us as a reader from the next part of the story. Alex thought of the man who had been his only relation for as long as he could remember. He had never known his own parents. They had died in an accident. That one, a plane crash, a few weeks after he'd been born. He had been brought up by his father's brother, never uncle. Ian Ryder had hated that word, and had spent most of his 14 years in the same terraced house in Chelsea, London, between the King's Road and the river. But it was only now Alex realised just how little he knew about the man. A banker. People said Alex looked quite like him. Ian Ryder was always travelling, a quiet, private man who liked good wine, classical music and books. He didn't seem to have any girlfriends. In fact, he didn't have any friends at all. He had kept himself fit, had never smoked, and had dressed expensively. But that wasn't enough. That wasn't a picture of life. It was only a thumbnail sketch. "Are you all right, Alex?" A young woman had come into the room. She was in her late 20s, with a sprawl of red hair and a round, boyish face. Jack Starbright was American. She had come to London as a student 7 years ago, rented a room in the house in return for light housework and babysitting duties, and had stayed on to become housekeeper and one of Alex's closest friends. Sometimes he wondered what the Jack was short for. Jackie, Jacqueline. Neither of them suited her, and although he had one sash, she never had said. Alex nodded. "What do you think will happen?" he asked. "What do you mean? To the house? To me? To you?" "I don't know," she shrugged. "I guess Ian will have made a will. He'll have left instructions. Maybe we should look in his office." "Yes, but not today, Alex. Let's take it one step at a time." Ian's office was a room running the full length of the house, high up at the top. It was the only room that was always locked. Alex had only been in there 3 or 4 times, never on his own. When he was younger, he had fantasised that there might be something strange up there, a time machine or a UFO. But it was only an office with a desk, a couple of filing cabinets, shelves full of papers and books. Bank stuff, that's what Ian said. Even so, Alex wanted to go up there now because it had never been allowed. "The police said he wasn't wearing his seatbelt." Alex turned to look at Jack. She nodded. "Yes, that's what they said. Doesn't that seem strange to you? You know how careful he was. He always wore his seatbelt. He wouldn't even drive me round the corner without making me put mine on." Jack thought for a moment and then shrugged. "Yeah, strange," she said. "But that must have been the way it was. Why would the police have lied?" So we're going to stop there and go back to our rainbow. And we're going to focus on this impact lens. So what is Anthony Horowitz wanting us to think at the moment? So the writer's intended impact at this point is, so 1 point for using it, the sentence starter, another point for answering it. Can you find me some evidence from the text for your 3rd point? And your 4th point, the bonus word, is selected. So pause the video. This is your 2nd sentence for the book talk session. Okay, how did you get on? And our final reason to read, we're going to focus on this stating predictions, which is really good to do at the end of a first chapter. So be thinking, where is this story going, or what questions is the author wanting us to think at this point? The day dragged on. Alex hadn't gone to school, even though secretly he had wanted to. He would have preferred to escape back into normal life, the clang of the bell, the crowds of familiar faces, instead of sitting there, trapped inside the house. But he had to be there for the visitors who came throughout the morning and the rest of the afternoon. There were 5 of them. A solicitor who knew nothing about a will, but seemed to have been charged with organising the funeral. A funeral director who'd been recommended by the solicitor. A vicar, tall, elderly, who seemed disappointed that Alex didn't look more upset. A neighbour from across the road. How did she even know that anyone had died? And finally a man from the bank. "All of us at the Royal and General are deeply shocked," he said. He was in his 30s, wearing a polyester suit with a Marks and Spencer tie. He had the sort of face you forgot even while you were looking at it, and had introduced himself as Crawley from personnel. "But if there's anything we can do—" "What will happen?" Alex asked for the 2nd time that day. "You don't have to worry," Crawley said. "The bank will take care of everything. That's my job. You leave everything to me." The day passed. Alex killed a couple of hours in the evening playing his PlayStation, and then felt vaguely guilty when Jack caught him at it. But what else was he to do? Later on, she took him to Burger King. He was glad to get out of the house, but the two of them barely spoke. Alex assumed Jack would have to go back to America. She certainly couldn't stay in London forever. So who would look after him? By law, he was still too young to look after himself. His whole future looked so uncertain that he preferred not to talk about it. He preferred not to talk at all. And then the day of the funeral arrived, and Alex found himself dressed in a dark jacket, preparing to leave in a black car that had come from nowhere, surrounded by people he had never met. Ian Ryder was buried in the Brompton Cemetery on the Fulham Road, just in the shadow of Chelsea Football Ground, and Alex knew where he would have preferred to be on that Wednesday afternoon. About 30 people had turned up, but he hardly recognised any of them. A grave had been dug close to the lane that ran the length of the cemetery, and as the service began, a black Rolls-Royce drew up, and the back door opened and a man got out. Alex watched him as he walked forward and stopped. Overhead, a plane coming in to land at Heathrow momentarily blotted out the sun. Alex shivered. There was something about the new arrival that made his skin crawl. And yet the man was ordinary to look at. Grey suit, grey hair, grey lips and grey eyes. His face was expressionless. The eyes behind the square, gunmetal spectacles completely empty. Perhaps that was what disturbed Alex. Whoever this man was, he seemed to have less life than anyone in the cemetery, above or below ground. Someone tapped Alex on the shoulder and turned round to see Mr. Crawley. And he turned round to see Mr. Crawley leaning over him. "That's Mr. Blunt," the personnel manager whispered. "He's the chairman of the bank." Alex's eyes travelled past Blunt and over to the Rolls-Royce. 2 more men had come with him, one of them the driver. They were wearing identical suits and, although it wasn't a particularly bright day, sunglasses. Both of them were watching the funeral with the same grim faces. Alex looked from them to Blunt, and then to the other people who'd come to the cemetery. Had they really known Ian Ryder? Why had he never met any of them before? And why did he find it so difficult to believe that any of them really worked for a bank? I'm going to leave that there. So we're going to go into this stating predictions lens, and I want us to use this sentence starter. So at this stage in the story, and we're nearly at the end of the first chapter, we believe that. As a reader, what are your thoughts? What are your predictions? So 1 mark for using that sentence starter, another for finishing it. Can you go back to the text and find me some evidence? And then your bonus word to get those 4 points is prioritise. Quite tricky. Have a go at that. So that's your 3rd sentence for today's session. So pause the video. That's your 3rd sentence, and I'll see you again on Thursday. Thank you, Year 6.